Today we are going to discuss A Court of Silver Flames. So A Court of Silver Flames is a standalone, I believe, book focusing on Nesta, Feyre's sister from the Catharsis series. And going into this, all I really knew was that it was a Nessian book, and that, so I didn't know it was standalone going in. I thought it was going to be like kind of the whole spin-off would be focusing on Nesta, but apparently it's going to focus on other characters. We're not sure about who specifically yet, but that's what we're getting. And in this book, what happens is Nesta, if you've read A Court of Frost and Starlight, where she is at that point after the war, is she's been drinking, gambling, hooking up with strangers, doing all those kinds of things as a way to sort of numb herself. So that's where we are by the beginning of this, and also at the end of Catharsis. So we're going to start my kind of non-spoilery review just to start. And what happens in this novel is Nesta starts out, you know, the same as she was in Catharsis, but then Cassian pretty much comes to her door, and he brings her to River House, which is the new house that Feyre and Rhys built, that we've seen also in Catharsis. And Feyre tells her sister, you either get your act together, train Cassian, or you get sent back to the Mortal Lands. So pretty much at the beginning, it's this big ultimatum, which is a choice, but not really a choice, because if she goes back to the Mortal Lands as a Fae, she's pretty much gonna only be able to be in hiding. She's not gonna be able to do anything, really. So her best option is to train Cassian at the House of Wind. And also, the story is mostly character-driven, which I love. Going into this, I really liked Nesta. I liked the fact that she was fiery and kind of bitchy. Like, I like that about her, because I feel like if she was a male character and she was, you know, dealing with this trauma in ways of, like, you know, hooking up, drinking, gambling, I feel like she would be seen as like this broody, like, male character if she was a male. But because she's female, some people give her a bad rap, and I feel like that's kind of wrong, because it's like, I don't know, is it because she's a woman you see her differently? But I love Nesta, and going into this, like, I wanted to see more about her character and see more about her character development especially. So this story has a big overarching theme of healing and dealing with trauma. So I wrote down, the story is heavily focused on healing from trauma and learning to love oneself and learn from past mistakes. It teaches you that it's okay to mess up and there will always be someone there to help, but only if you let them in. So that's pretty much the gist of what's happening with Nesta. She's in this really dark place, and her family pretty much wants to get her out of that place. And the way that they're trying to do that is have her train, have her, you know, occupy her thoughts with something else. There should also be really big content / trigger warnings in this, mostly sexual assault, abuse, PTSD, and traumatic labor. I think that is something that we should definitely mention, is the fact that, like, there are some very dark topics in this book, and if that makes you uncomfortable, kind of like tread lightly with this. And we are going to get into this later, but I've noticed there are a lot of kind of mirror experiences with Nesta, as the same that Feyre experienced in Catharsis. So I'm going to talk about that later, but there are like a couple plot points that for me really reminded me of Catharsis. And I guess not in a bad way that's like ripping off Catharsis, but definitely it's kind of like a mirror. It's just a different character going through different things, but it's the sisters at some point have had the same experiences to a certain degree. And that is the extent of my non-spoilery discussion. Pretty much, I love the book. I think it is a good jumping off point from Catharsis, which was a little disappointing. I really loved this. I think this was a good follow-up. And Catharsis did really well at bridging the gap between the original trilogy and this, so I will say it was good at that. But if you haven't read A Court of Silver Flames yet, please do so, because I'm going to launch into my spoilery-filled discussion. So I took very extensive notes on this, and I did it like chapter to chapter. So if I'm like going kind of, if it's taking me long and going kind of slow, it's because I literally did it from like chapter to chapter, and like my thoughts and notes and like what I thought was important to mention. So at the beginning of the story, we see Cassian kind of come to Nesta's house, and she has a guy there that, you know, spent the night, and Cassian has to bring her to River House. And there we kind of had this kind of confrontation with Feyre and Rhys, because Feyre apparently got this bill, this really big bill of like these exotic wines and this gambling bill that Nesta put on, I guess, like their bank account or whatever. I don't know how it works exactly, but she spent an exorbitant amount of money, and they want her to, you know, stop doing all this, you know, stop wasting money and stop, you know, driving herself, you know, further into like, you know, rock bottom. So her option is to move to the House of Wind, get away from the city, because the city is where, you know, the taverns, the gambling halls are all at. So for her to avoid that, she has to go to the House of Wind and train with Cassian. And of course, at first, Nesta's like, no, I'm not going to the House of Wind, and no, I'm not training with him. And, you know, they're like, well, it's either that or you go to the human lands. And then Feyre tells her, well, we're packing your bags up now as we speak, so you really have no option. So she has no option, and she ends up going there, where she hates it there. And at first, Cassian and Nesta end up training in Windhaven in Elyria. And of course, Nesta doesn't do it. She kind of sits down on a rock in the freezing cold, and Cassian is very disappointed in her. And, you know, they have this whole thing where like they're not talking because she's like being stubborn and not wanting to train. And Cassian also gets this sort of, not side quest, but I kind of want to say side quest, where he wants him to do more work besides being a general in Elyria. He wants him to talk to Eris, who is sort of their ally at this point, and pretty much do courtier business, which obviously Cassian's not accustomed to, but he's kind of breaking him out of his usual role. And during the first training session, the one in which Nesta's not really training, we do see Nesta's kind of contradicting thoughts. Her thoughts a lot of times contradict her actions. So on page 72, it says, "Get up," a small voice whispered in her head, her bones. "Don't humiliate him like this. Don't give these assholes the satisfaction of seeing him made a fool." But her body refused to move. She'd drawn her line, and to yield to him, to anyone. So pretty much Nesta has these thoughts that kind of contradict what she actually does, but it's like her stubbornness kind of wins in the end. So by chapter 8, we have the first instance where Nesta tries to go down the steps of the House of Wind, and there's, mind you, like 10,000 steps. So she is also very out of shape and thin. So she's going to try to climb these steps, which she fails at. And of course, Cassian sees her on her way back up, and she's like panting and tired, and it's kind of funny. And then he kind of teases her about it afterwards. And at a certain point, they start to like kind of flirt a little bit. Like there's this little back and forth that we start to see, which is like the beginnings of it. And after this, they train the next day. Well, Cassian does. Nesta still refuses because she's like, I don't want to train that miserable village. But then after being cold, sitting out in the cold for a while, she goes into a shop, which is where she meets Emery, who we met in Akafas. And they have like this back and forth, and like this is like one of the first times she's talking to someone, like really talking to someone outside of like the inner circle. And they have like this moment where she wants to buy something and she's like, I can't. And she doesn't want to tell her that like, yeah, I kind of exhausted my funds because I was gambling the whole time. And while this training is happening, she's also working in the library. So after training, she goes down to the library with Clotho, one of the priestesses. And during this time, she meets Gwen, who's a fellow priestess. And we find out more about her later on. But it starts to kind of be like the budding of a new friendship. And it's this moment where like Nesta, like the way she is with people, and she's really short with people. So when she's talking to Gwen, she's like, I doubt you'll enjoy the way I speak to most people. And Gwen's like, try me. And Nesta's like, get out of my sight. And Gwen's just like, oh, you're good. So it's like the first moment where she doesn't like push someone away, and she's almost surprised that she's not pushing people away, given the way that she acts. And then Cassian has this kind of heart-to-heart with Feyre, talking about Nesta, and then he realizes something. She pretty much was saying, I don't want to train in that miserable village. So what he does is, instead of taking her up to Windhaven to train, they train in the sparring ring at the House of Wind, so that she's in a more, I guess, comfortable situation. And this is where they make their bargain, where if Nesta agrees to train with Cassian for at least an hour, Nesta can call in a bargain of whatever size later on. So this is important for later. And during the training, she kind of starts out slow. Cassian surprisingly tells her to start out with, you have to wiggle your toes so you can get good balance. And also during this time, she's starting to eat again. She's starting to feel hungry, because for a while she was thin because she just wasn't eating. So we're seeing progress very slowly, but it's like in little increments. We're seeing like proof of like how she's building up, how she's progressing. Also, when she's back in the library, Gwen kind of tells her that like, hey, I messed up. My supervisor Meryl's gonna be really mad at me because I gave her the wrong book. And it's so funny because this whole part where like Nesta is trying to like switch out, I think what, volume 7 for volume 8 or vice versa, and giving it to Meryl, it reminds me of like a side quest in like Skyrim or something, like playing like an RPG game and like someone's like, hey, if you do this for me, I'll give you like, I don't know, like 50 in gold or something. Like, I don't know, it just felt like something in a video game, like a side quest, which like I don't mind it, but it was kind of funny. Like reading it, it's just like, why does this feel like something in like a video game? I don't know, it just feels like that for some reason. And once Nesta kind of does her task, her side quest, so to speak, Nesta asks Gwen, what's Meryl researching? And she mentions like different realms, different worlds, living on top of each other without even knowing it. And I think this is like a clue into like this whole, what I believe like to be a multiverse with Sarah J Maas. Like she's doing this thing where like it's mentioned like in the Word Gates in Throne of Glass. It's also mentioned in Crescent City, like how there are multiple worlds. So I feel like maybe she's building up to something, considering that she's mentioning it here. We're probably going to see it at some point. Also, this is where we get our first introduction to the Valkyries, where Gwen pretty much explains to Nesta what the Valkyries are, who they were, these female warriors from a different time before the war pretty much wiped them completely out. An interesting part about this book too is we see more about Nesta's childhood, also by extension all the Archeron sisters, their childhood. So now we know that Nesta's mother was pretty much doting on her, and her mother gave her all the attention, whereas like their father gave Feyre and Elaine more attention. Her mother was very strict, very cold and calculating, which kind of is where Nesta gets that from, her mother. But while Nesta is sort of making friends with Emery and Gwen, she's also making friends with the house. So she's been talking to the house, and the house starts actually doing things for her. Like it gets her like dinner, a bath, and a book, and she gets to the point where she's like, yeah, I think you might be my only friend, to the actual house. We also, I think it was during a training session, we learned more about Cassian. So it was mentioned briefly in Akamath, like his mother and the fact that she died. But this is like giving more information, the fact that she was an unwed female and his father forced himself on his mother. So that's what came to be. And pretty much she was forced to work herself to death. And like he was young and wasn't strong enough to actually go back to the village and help her, and by the time Cassian came back, his mother was already dead. So that was a whole thing. And also he killed pretty much everyone who was responsible for his mother's suffering, as well as and Rhys. They helped with that too. And the house is a pretty interesting character. I'm gonna refer to the house as a character from now on, because the house does this thing where like if Nesta needs something, the house will get it for her. But like there's one time where she's kind of sitting in the room and it's like, I don't want to eat out there, and the house just opens her door, and then she's like, no, and then it opens the door wider, and to the point where she's just like, okay fine, I guess I'll eat in the dining room table with them. Like that is kind of funny, like how the house is just like, no, go out. Like I would love to have a house that just tells me what to do. Like that's lovely, and bring me books. That would be really nice to have this house. So after they have dinner, like Nesta and Cassian kind of had this moment, and then afterwards they're both kind of like all riled up, so they both like masturbate at the same exact time. And then the next day while they're training, he pretty much gives this whole spiel on like explaining to Nesta the Blood Rite, what it entails, like explaining more or less the history behind it. Like when you're a Ritzian, you make it to the mountain, and Carthinian are the people who scale the entire summit and are the winners. And then this gives Nesta the idea to have the priestesses train, and you know, Cassian's like, hey, that's actually pretty good. And you know, she puts up this flyer, like a sign-up sheet pretty much, in the library, and see if someone actually signs up. Of course, no one at first does it, and she's really disappointed. And at this point, we have the argument between Elaine and Nesta, and it's interesting to see how Elaine in Akawar was the one who was like kind of like a shell of herself, was thin, was kind of like out of it and far removed from everyone, whereas like that's Nesta now. And Nesta even comments on the fact that like, you know, Elaine looks healthy and happier and like clear-eyed now, but like they're pretty much in the same situation at different times, which I thought was really interesting. If you think about it, Feyre was also in the same situation, so all the sisters kind of dealt with similar traumas and dealt with it in similar ways. And something that we didn't previously know about Elaine is that apparently she lost her virginity to Grayson a month before she was turned into Fae, which might have been mentioned before, but as far as I know, that was never mentioned, which definitely changes, not a lot, but it does change like Elaine's situation. It's like, okay, so she wasn't a virgin by the time it happened, so it's like a matter of like how we all think she's innocent, but like I feel like there is more to Elaine, and we do see that later on in the book that there is a lot more to her than meets the eye. After this, when they're training the next day, they have this conversation that kind of leads to this argument where Cassian's like, we've been working for barely 2 weeks. Physically, you've been seeing changes, but mentally, you're still stuck in the same place. And then he's like, took Feyre mumps, and then Nesta's like, I don't want to hear about Feyre and her special journey. And they still continue this argument until it reaches a point where Nesta, in anger, kisses Cassian. And they have this moment where like she kind of jerks him off and he gets off, and then he's like embarrassed, and then Nesta says something like, quick off the mark. And I'm just like, whoop-de-doo. And it's like Cassian is like embarrassed like the whole next day, and he's just like, oh no, what did I do? So the next day between them is a little awkward because neither of them really want to talk about it. At least Cassian doesn't. But they get called to River House, which is where Feyre and Rhys live, and they're told about the mask and the fact that Queen Braylon, which is one of the human queens that was turned Fae, but she was turned into an old crone instead, and she kind of wants to get her revenge because of that. She's kind of coming back, and she has the crown, which is a part of this thing called the Dread Trove, which it consists of the crown, the harp, and the mask. And then they're pretty much asking like if Nesta can get the mask because, you know, she was made, and the fact that, you know, only someone who was made can really track it. And at first someone asks like, well, how are we gonna find the Dread Trove? And then Elaine kind of steps out and is like, using me. And then Nesta is like, no, we're not doing that. And Nesta's like, I can't. And then Elaine still wants to do it, and then Nesta and Feyre are just like, no, Elaine, you can't do that. And then Nesta's like, hey, Feyre, you were made too, why don't you do it? And then Feyre's like, I can't. She's like, why not? I can't risk it because I'm pregnant. Dun dun dun. Which, I mean, if you've ACOFAS know that they were trying for a baby, but if you read Kingdom of Ash, you kind of know like that it was kind of setting up for that, like you knew it was going to happen at some point, so it's not really a surprise. But I guess it's kind of like, yeah, for like the characters in the book, it's a surprise, you know, that she's pregnant. And Feyre's pregnancy is also the reason why, part of the reason why Rhys had like that shield around her, because he didn't want her or the baby to get hurt. And apparently you can scent pregnancy, like if you lift the shields, like you can smell it, like I guess you can smell the new life, which is interesting because apparently Faye can just smell everything. Also, Feyre reveals to Nesta first that it's a boy, and Nesta kind of asks, why are you telling me? And she's like, well, Elaine found out that she was pregnant first, so she felt like this is something she can give Nesta as like, you know, something for her sister to like know first. And later on, Azrael and Cassian are talking about the future and possibly having kids, and Az is like, I'm not sure, maybe. And then Az asks Cassian if he wants kids, and he's like, yeah, I want kids. Of course I want children. And he's pretty much like longing for what Feyre and Rhys has. Like, it's not jealousy, but it's definitely this kind of sense of longing. Like, he wants what they have. Like, he wants a mate, and he wants children in the future, and this whole, like, the whole shebang. And then the next scene, we have the first, well, I guess not the first round of smut. Definitely one of the first ones where, like, Cassian's like, we have a debt between us because the couple chapters ago, like, he got off, but she didn't, and he kind of wants to repay the debt, or return the favor. So they have this thing where, you know, they're like, this day's out of training, and then Nesta's like, just sex. And he's like, yeah, just sex. So they have this thing where they hook up for a bit, you know, he goes down on her, it's nice, but, you know, they kind of agreed to keep emotions out of the whole thing. And then later on, she asks Gwen in the library about what she knows about the Dread Trove, and she pretty much is like, I'm gonna see what I can find about it. And she kind of briefly talks about training. She's like, well, why would a priestess want muscular thighs? And she's like, well, maybe to defend yourself. And then Nesta has this grand idea. So then the next day, Clotho pretty much communicates to Cassian, and it's just like, Nesta has been practicing in the library, and for 5 days she has been ignoring my commands to stop. So then Cassian is like, what the fuck are you doing, Nesta? And apparently she's doing something wrong. So as she's, you know, practicing, he helps her out and he like shows her the right moves. And also Cassian notices when he looks up, the priestesses are watching. And Cassian's like, wait, earlier today you had the perfect form. And Nesta's like, yeah. And her whole idea was just like, well, if I can't get them to go there, I'm gonna get the priestess to see what they're missing as far as training, which is admittedly a really smart idea. Good on you, Nesta. And the next day when she goes back into the library, we see one name on the sign-up sheet and it's Gwen. And then there's the end of part 1, which is Novice. So the fun thing about this is the parts are named after the progression into becoming a Valkyrie. So it starts out as Novice, and then there's Blade, and then there's a Valkyrie. So there's like multiple levels to it, which we see in the book itself. And then later, Nesta sees Cassian at the table, and he's kind of like stressed out about the whole Air situation. And, you know, Nesta like feels bad for him. So she comforts him in the only way she really knows how, and that is through her sexuality. So she goes and gives him head, and then like afterwards, right when they're about to like finish up, they hear Az coming down the hall, and then Az walks in and he's just like he knows what happens, and Nesta hurry up and leave. And then Az is just like, don't show your hand all at once, Cass. And he's like, what's that supposed to be? And Az is like, save some for later. And I'm just like, bro, like, I love how Cassian knows. I mean, I love how Az knows, and Az is supposed to be the chaperone, but he's like not the best at being the chaperone, you know? And afterwards, Nesta gets Cassian to send Emery some gifts in the form of spices. So apparently in Ilaria, they don't really use spices. They don't like, you know, season their food that much. I don't know why. But yeah, that's a gift to Emery, and then that kind of incentivizes Emery to actually go to training. So the next day, Emery shows up, and then they have like this kind of moment where like Emery, Gwen, and Nesta kind of bond over books, and they were little romance books and reading, which is so cute. Like, it's just like, they're nerds just like me. Like, I was like totally related to them in that exact moment. And also Rhys was the one to winnow Emery, you know, to and from Windhaven. So there's this moment where like Rhys just comes back after training, and he says to Nesta, you were to treat Gwen with kindness and respect. And then Nesta's like, mind your own business. And it's like they have like this kind of like level of animosity towards them at first, and then Cassian's like, I could have done without you giving us a mental warning. And it's like pretty much Cassian's mad that like Rhys can't believe one good thing about Nesta. Like like Rhys is pretty much assuming the worst about Nesta, and Nesta also is kind of doing the same with him. But also I wanted to bring up the fact that like, it's not that like, I feel like in Akafest I really didn't like Rhys from his perspective, but like Rhys in this book, the fact that he kind of is like a side character in this book, but it's like, it's from Nesta's perspective. So it's like, because Nesta doesn't like Rhys, it's like Rhys's personality is different, you know, compared to Feyre's perspective, even Cassian's perspective of Rhys. Like, Nesta doesn't like Rhys really, so it shows in, you know, how she views him. So I guess that would explain why, like, I wouldn't say like Rhys is completely unlikable in this book, but he's kind of like a dick at times in this book, more than usual. And that's probably why, is because it's from Nesta's point of view. So it's through the eyes of like how Nesta sees Rhys, how Nesta sees Cassian, and so on. And even like Amryn and the rest of the inner circle, kind of like it shifts in like how you view them, because it's like you're looking not through Feyre's kind of glorified perspective of them, but rather Nesta's, I don't want to say more honest perspective, but definitely more yeah, definitely like not glorified perspective. But, you know, going back to the main story, more priestesses come to the training. I think it's Rosalind and Deirdre that are at the training now. So there's more people training, and, you know, it's this thing where it's like they all are training to become Valkyries. They want to be able to defend themselves. And then later on, Nesta tries to find the rest of the Dread Trove through scrying. But like when she's doing it, she tries to do it and she's like, yeah, I don't think I have the power anymore. And then Cassian's like, well, just try. And she's like, yeah, no, this is not gonna work. But then later that night, she has sort of this really bad nightmare, which like jolts Cassian and Az awake, and she is on fire. It's like a silver fire that's like cold, so she's covered in these flames. And then like I guess Rhys gets word of it, and he comes and pretty much like soothes her, and then at some point like it dies down and she goes back to sleep. So after this, Cassian goes to Rhys the next day, and there's some bad news about Feyre's pregnancy. So apparently the baby has wings, which normally would be good, but the issue is Illyrian wings don't work well with a high Fae female because the anatomy doesn't work. Only Illyrian women have the right anatomy to be able to push a baby out with wings. So it's a high chance that Feyre might die during childbirth, and we're learning this, and that's why Rhys is like stressed out now. And they're trying to find, you know, maybe Helion can find a way to fix it, or Thesson, who's like a healer, to see if, you know, they can save Feyre at this point. And later that night, like when Cassian's all bloodied up for getting beat up by Rhys because he needed a way to like get the anger out, Nesta's like, what the fuck is wrong with you? And then he tells her about like Feyre and the baby. And the next day she's at River House so that they can, you know, scry. And she promises to Rhys, like, you know, mind to mind, they're like, yeah, I won't say a word to Feyre, don't worry about it. But when she's crying, they have this long moment where, you know, she wanders off, she's not fully there, and then her body starts to get really cold, like almost like she's stuck in a way. And like, I think it was described as like her mind shields were up, so like Rhys nor Feyre could even get in with their Damati powers. And also Nesta's like pretty much frozen at this point, so Cassian does what he feels like is needed to be done, which is tongue kiss her while she's frozen, and everyone's like there in the room and watching. And I'm just thinking, like, so no one's like thinking about like, oh, this is interesting, what's that curtain over there? Like, they're just sitting and watching this, or are they just like turning their heads like, this is really awkward? Like, I don't know, this was like very weird at this point. And then like, I mean, Nesta does come too, but it's still kind of like, bro, who, like, why did he think this was a good idea just to do in front of everybody? So from the screen, Nesta finds out that the mask is in the Book of Horrors, so they head there later on, and Feyre is kind of worried because she's like, Nesta hasn't had enough training, and then they're just like, oh no, we'll be fine, you know, we have plenty of weapons, we're armed to the teeth. And they kind of warn Nesta of like the dangers, like kelpies and things such as that are in the bog that you should try to avoid. So when they're there, like at first they don't sense it, but then something happens to Az. So some of Eris's soldiers kind of come in and are attacking them. So Cassian's like, I have to go help Az. And then Nesta's like, well, what about me? And then he kind of puts her in a retreat somewhere safe. And of course Nesta starts getting worried, so she ends up going back to the ground. And then as soon as she's going towards the water, out comes a kelpie. So it's like, this is like a really scary scene. Like when it was happening, I was just like, oh my god. But like, it's scary because it's like, kelpie comes up, he drags her down, and you know, he's like, pretty much they torture you before they kill you. Like they kind of play with you before you kill you. So like, Nesta's being dragged down into the water and she can't breathe, and while she's like struggling and thrashing, all of a sudden there's like golden light starts coming towards her, and it is, lo and behold, the mask. So she managed to get out of the kelpie's clutches, and she puts the mask on. So what the mask can do is it can raise the dead, and you can control armies of the dead. So that's exactly what Nesta does. So out of the ground come out like these decomposed corpses, these skeletons, and they all come and attack the kelpie, which, you know, was well deserved. So afterwards, they're closest to the Court of Nightmares, so they go to the Court of Nightmares and they interrogate the two of Eris's soldiers that they were able to take with them. And there is this like spell that's like latched onto them, and they think it's because of Brylan's spell that they put on, and Eris may or may not know like what's happening with the soldiers, so they interrogate him on that. But the spell is like on them so tight that they're pretty much gonna ask Helion Spellcleaver if he can fix it. And also later that day, because they're still up at, you know, the palace on top of the Hone City, that Nesta's kind of bathing, washing the day off because, you know, she was in the bog and it was all gross and she was attacked. And Cassian comes in with food, and, you know, Nesta's just like, hey, do you want to get in? And Cassian's like, you're hurt? And she's like, do I look injured to you? Cassian's just like looking at her cuts all over her body. He's like, well, yeah, you look hurt. You look pretty hurt to me. And then, you know, she gets out of the tub fully naked, and he's obviously just like, oh, well, I guess I can't resist this. So she reminds him, like, this is just sex. This can be nothing more than sex, Cassian. Cassian has this, like, this moment where he's thinking about it, and he's like, yeah, sure, fine. And then they do the do. And the funny thing about SJM Smut is, like, it's like sometimes you get like smut that you expect, and all of a sudden she says something like, he was devouring her, melting her body like a piece of chocolate on his tongue. And you're like, didn't expect you to say that. And the next day at training, Emery like automatically notices, and Emery's like, you took him to bed, didn't you? And Nesta's like, what makes you think that? And she's like, well, you guys been giving each other googly eyes all morning. And then this is when, like, because Nesta's distracted, Gwen is kind of like, hey, I can teach you this Valkyrie technique called mind stilling, which is pretty much meditation, sort of meditative exercise that the Valkyries did. And then because Nesta's distracted, Cassian is like giving her this practice sword, and he's like, do block 1, slice 3, like do stuff with the sword. And as like this is happening, Nesta has like this kind of internal monologue of like, she can see the King of Hybern, the Cauldron, and the Ravens, see the Kelpie and Thomas and all those people who had sneered at the Archeron's poverty and aspiration, the friends who had walked away with smiles on their faces. And at this point, she's like, never again. She will never be weak again, or never be at someone's mercy. And that's when like something kind of clicked, not only for Nesta, but also for the other women who were training there. It's like something clicked, like, yeah, never again. And it's a really powerful moment. And like that one scene where it's just like, you know, we're not gonna back down anymore. And it's just like, you go, girl. You go, Nesta. And in the library the next day, Gwen teaches Nesta these mind-stilling exercises, and as we mentioned earlier in the book, we saw that Nesta has like this kind of roaring of thoughts, like she thinks so loudly and she's not able to dampen her down. That's why she was drinking and covered up with drinking, because that was, you know, her way of numbing herself so she didn't feel anything, because she was feeling and thinking too much. But mind-stilling is like a way for her to meditate, but also to keep those thoughts at bay. Like she does have like these thoughts of like, I'm not good enough for Elaine. Elaine chose Feyre. Amren chose Feyre. But then she's like, you know, I acknowledge these thoughts and they're valid, but I'm letting them go. And it's a good way. It's like, I don't know, this is like part fantasy romance, this is part like a self-help book. And I'm just like, oh, I should probably start doing mind-stilling exercises. This might be helpful for a lot of people. Like, I don't know, but it's definitely helping Nesta out in the best way. And then my fave, Helion, shows up. And of course, this man has to make a dramatic appearance. So this dude shows up on an actual Pegasus. And I did not know Pegasus existed in this universe until like this page where they're explaining like, oh yeah, there's Helion has like this whole thing of Pegasus. And I'm just like, bro, what? like I'm just like, I don't know. I just never, that's one part of the book that I just never got over. I'm just like, this man rode in to the Night Court on a horse with wings. And everyone, like, literally everyone's, like, amazed by it. Like, even Rhys is kind of just like, holy shit, it's a Pegasus. Like, everyone is like, whoa, dude, that's kind of cool. And I'm like, same. But, you know, like, Helion goes and, like, places the ward on the Maas so that, like, no one can get into it, because it's such a powerful weapon. You don't want anyone just walking in. So he does that. And they also have this conversation to Azrael about, like, taking out the spies. Because, you know, Braylon, she has the crown and she can control people. So, like, Azrael's spies may not be able to be trusted. So, as, like hell I will. And Feyre and Rhys at some point convince him to, like, take them out, even though, like, it makes Az mad. So, at this point, we find out, I think I failed to mention it, but, like, when Cassian took Nesta to the blacksmith just outside of Valaire's, when she was, you know, hammering down the blades, learning how to, like, make them, to forge them, apparently she made them in the way that, like, you know, the Dread Trove was made. So pretty much she makes a whole new Dread Trove with these two swords and, like, the dagger, and they're trying to figure out, like, what to do with it. And they're like, well, Nesta possesses the Cauldron's power, so anything she crafts and imbues with her power becomes a new trove. And then Amren's like, at this point I wouldn't so much as eat a piece of bread if she toasted it. And I'm like, oh, it's that deep. Like, and it's like, you find out she made something else later, but I don't think it's revealed right now, that she can just make things. And they briefly talk about, you know, Feyre's pregnancy and the fact that the Peregrines and the Seraphim, they have wings, but their wings are flexible. So, like, a non-winged female can easily give birth to them, but Illyrian wings are very different. They're bony, they're less flexible, so that's part of the reason why it would kill her. and you know, they're asking Helene to find like anything that could possibly save her, but you know, it's kind of hard at this point because it's like, so it's not well documented, so no one even knows what's going to happen. And then later Amren's kind of talking about, you know, the swords and mentioning like, hey Rhys, this isn't a power to be a High King. You want to be a High King? And Rhys is like, no, not really. He's like, I don't want to be a conqueror. And then Amren's kind of just like, you know, we're weakened right now. If there was a High King to bring us all together, you know, that would help. And Amren, okay, at first I was like, no, this is too much power. Like, the High King is way too much power. But then Amren makes a good point. She's like, explain to me why, after thousands of years, objects that once crowned and aided the old Fae have returned. The last time a High King ruled Prithian, it was with a magic sword in his hand. Look at that great sword before you, Rhys, and tell me that is not a sign from the cauldron itself. And then Cassian's just like, it's a fluke. But I'm just like, okay, Amren did make a pretty good point. That is a point. Like, oh yeah, the timing, and also in addition to the Dread Trove, and the fact that Nesta made a Dread Trove, you also have 3 women who were made. Like, yeah, the timing is kind of just like, is that a fluke? Or is it like, yeah, the cauldron's trying to say like, hey, if anyone's going to be the High King and it's going to be like a fair and just ruler, it's probably going to be you. So yeah, just think about it. They also, when they're like doing like the business with Eris, they run into Talon at the Spring Court. Nesta like more or less scares Talon away, and then Cassian's like, well, you handled the Talon situation really well. And she's just like, Feyre, I mean, you know, he never deserved Feyre. And then like Cassian's like, yeah, no, obviously he didn't. Like, yeah. And then later on, I think it's just Cassian at the river house. You know, they're talking about the fact that, you know, like, oh yeah, Nesta and the priestesses are training to be Valkyries, and Feyre's like, oh bro, that's cool. And there we find out that like Cassian's first lover beyond the Night Court's borders had been a Valkyrie named Tanwyn. So that's like a little backstory in him, because I think I was always curious with like everyone in the Night Court how it's mentioned like they have had countless lovers, and then it's like, okay, can we see one of them? Who were they? How long were they together? You know, it's like a lot of mysteries, because like these people are 500 years old. They've had at least relationships that had at least last like a decade, you know, like at least long enough, because it feels weird if it's just like, what, they're not in a serious relationship, they have a mate. Like, it just, I don't know, that feels a little unrealistic. So at least now we know that like, yeah, he was with a Valkyrie, which is interesting information. And while they're at this dinner table, Elaine mentions that Nesta used to be a dancer, a really good one at that. Before, you know, they lost all their money and were poor, they would go to balls and they would do dances. And there was this guy back at home who Elaine liked, but you know, there was this woman that I guess he was almost betrothed to that hated Elaine. So Nesta's revenge was to, you know, dance with him and pretty much seduce him. And then he asked for her hand in marriage, and she's only like 14. They're like, isn't that a little young? And she's like, yeah, of course her father said no, but the fact that she was able to seduce the guy, and of course that gives Rhys this like little idea. And then the next chapter, while during training, they're a little distracted, you know, Nesta and crew. So Cassian asked her, you know, if you had a sword, what would you name it? And I think what, like, Gwen is like, Silver Majesty. Like, what? And then Nesta's like, I guess I would name it Killer. And then she's like, why? Cassian's like, don't worry about it. And she's like, dude, why? And of course Cassian, being honest to a fault, he's like, so you kind of made this sword that's magical now, and you know, I kind of wanted to give it to you. And she's like, well, how long have you known? Because he slips up and says like, we talked about it. And she's like, well, who the fuck is we? And people voted against her, and it was Rhys and Amren who voted against her, like, not knowing. And she's pissed off about it, you know, rightfully so. So she marches down the steps, like, out of anger. She gets all the way down the 10,000 steps, goes all the way to Valaris, and then she goes to Amren's place. And Amren is in the middle of doing the do with Varian, so it's like very bad timing, but it's like also like on brand for Nesta. So Varian goes away real quick, and then as soon as possible Feyre gets there, I guess, as damage control. And you know, Nesta being angry about not being told about, you know, the swords, she goes and tells Feyre that, you know, her life's in danger and she's probably gonna die giving birth. And, you know, of course Feyre's like shocked. And, you know, Amren's like, oh my god, like Feyre, it's best you talk to Rhys about this. And of course, like, everyone's angry at Nesta, and Rhys confronts Cassian and is just like, get Nesta out of the city right now before I fucking kill her. And I'm just like, ooh, he's mad. So yeah, Cassian and Nesta and going off, Azrael gives them like a pack of like survival stuff. So they go off into the wilderness away from the city because, you know, she messed up bad. And they're gonna go on this like pretty long hike as like a way to, you know, chill out. And of course when Feyre, like, you know, mind speaks to Cassian, she's kind of like, I mean, I'm kind of glad Nesta told me, like, why didn't you guys tell me? And I was thinking that, like, when they decided this, I was just like, I mean, it is Feyre's body, like, why not, like, she's the one that's gonna, like, have to give birth and possibly die, and you guys aren't gonna tell her about it. Like, I feel like that was something that made me mad, because I was just like, I don't agree with that decision to just not tell her. Like, you're gonna keep her in the dark, and, like, I don't know, it's just kind of ridiculous that, like, no one thought to tell her, especially Rhys. Like, dude, you want everything to be her choice, but then you're gonna rob her of this, like, pretty big tidbit of information. And everyone's like, well, we didn't want you to be stressed. Like, no, like, I think that's something that, you know, you should be able to be stressed about, you know? And during this point in the hike is, like, where we really see into Nesta's inner thoughts and, like, how she feels about herself, like, a self-hatred that she has. And not gonna lie, this was the chapter that I, like, shed a couple tears, because I really resonated with everything Nesta was going through, and the self-hatred and the fact that she feels like all the mistakes that she made, everything is her fault, and, you know, she just pushes people away. And it's so sad. And, like, as they're on the hike, you know, there's moments where, like, he kind of says, like, oh yeah, if you faint, you might fall off the mountain and break every bone in your body. And, like, she doesn't say, like, well, good, but, like, Cassian kind of knows, like, what she's thinking at this point. And then they are hiking for about 2 days, and Nesta at some point forgets or doesn't want to drink water, so she ends up fainting briefly. And, you know, they continue, but before taking a break. And as they're walking again, like, she has this kind of, like, internal thoughts about everything, and about, you know, she had been born wrong and she doesn't know how to fix herself. And this is right, like, this emotional moment where she, like, just gets down and just cries, like, she just sobs, and she kind of just can't stop it. And Cassian is kind of trying to comfort her, and he's like, hey, I'm here. And she ends up talking about her father, saying that, you know, she can't undo the fact that she let him die. And, you know, Cassian's just like, hey, this isn't your fault. And at this point, Nesta explains the reason why she's so adverse to being around fires is because they crack, similar to how, like, a bone cracks, like her father's neck. And then Cassian is kind of realizing the fact that he had a fire going the past couple nights in the woods, and he's like, oh, why didn't I think of that? Like, every time she's hearing the fire, she's hearing her father's neck crack, and that's why she's been so far away from it. And then at this point, Nesta was saying, like, how the last words that her father said to her was that he always loved her from the moment, you know, she was born, and she was like, she didn't deserve that love. She feels like she didn't deserve it at all. And Cassian comforts her by telling you know, I could tell you about how my mother's death nearly destroyed me, you know, how I suffered during the 49 years that Rhys was taken captive by Amarantha, and that, you know, he's killed so many people, but he's like, I'm not going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you about what I did to get through it, and, like, how I keep going, and how, like, the tears, you feeling like this means that you care and that you're feeling something. And he tells Nesta that, you know, she's not broken. There's nothing broken to be fixed. It's just a matter of her healing. She needs to heal from everything that she's been through, and she has been through a lot. So after, you know, that whole, you know, very emotionally cathartic scene, Nesta goes back to training a couple days later after they've done the hike, and Gwen kind of tells her about the fact that they have these services where they sing, and it's like these kind of religious services. And because Nesta loves music, it was, you know, good for her to be there. So apparently Gwen sings very well. And as they're in this mountain, the stone from the mountain and, you know, Nesta's bones in her body kind of cause her to end up scrying, like accidentally. So that way she ends up finding the harp, and she finds out the harp is in the prison, underneath the prison. So at this point they get to the prison and, you know, to find the harp. It's funny because Nesta, like, how I was annoyed at the fact they say like calls alike so many times. Like Nesta literally says, maybe the harp will do the same. Like calls alike, as you all enjoy saying. And I'm like, yeah, why do they say that so much? I'm starting to get tired of it. But the point is, they end up going through the prison. They're not supposed to speak about anything because like the inmates can hear, and you don't want them to hear what you're thinking. So they go through this kind of like door that's sort of like a portal. So they end up going to the room that the harp is in, and only Nesta can get through because like she's able to get through the boards and all that. So when she gets near the harp, she has this kind of, not vision, but this kind of yeah, like vision where she sees Braelyn, and Braelyn sees her. So Braelyn knows that she found the harp, and it's this moment where Nesta's like, hey, can you let me go? And also during this time she finds out through another vision that the harp was at some point used to trap someone into the stone, believed to be inside the prison. And then, you know, after she grabs the harp, she's like, hey, we gotta get out of here. We gotta skedaddle. And so as they're on the way out, Nesta is kind of like, hey, I named the sword Ataraxia. And Cassian's like, ooh, Ataraxia, I like that. He's like, it's better than Killer or Silver Majesty. And it's like, yeah. And then Nesta is like having this cutesy moment with Cassian, and she's like, you know, I think you might be my friend, Cassian. And Cassian's like, I've always been your friend, Nesta, always. And then Nesta's about to say like something like, and I've always, and then Blanxus, which is the monster creature thing that Cassian put into prison centuries before. His cell is now open, so it's like this moment where it's like, oh, we gotta go. And Cassian tries to send Nesta off and is just trying to keep her safe, even though he knows he's probably gonna die if he has to face Lanthus, I think that's how you say his name, again. And Lanthus kind of exists in like this like mist form, so like he's kind of drawing around them and he's like talking to them, and they're afraid, obviously. But then this guy says, and you fairies are all blind to your own selves. Based upon scent alone, I would say that you two are. And then it gets cut off because Cassian is just like throwing Nesta behind and just like, run! And then they start fighting, and then Nesta's like running, and she goes outside, and then she sees some of Eris's soldiers like on their way there. So she's thinking quickly, and she's like, the harp, what does the harp do? And she like plucks the strings, because like it tells her like it opens doors and pathways, it can move through space and time. So her idea is to like pluck the first string, and it's just like, hey, take me back to Cassian. She gets there, she pulls out Ataraxia, and she managed just to trap Lanthus in a human form. And then, you know, Lanthus is kind of like, oh, what are you? And then he finds out like the power that she has, that her name's Nesta, and he kind of tries to seduce her. Like he sends her this image of, you know, them like sitting on a throne room together with like these like hounds that look like the things that are in the Court of Nightmares. And then she like blinks away. She's like, yeah, no, that's not gonna happen. And while like she's sort of like distracting him, Cassian managed to send like a blade into his heart, and then Nesta, being the badass she is, slices the guy's head off. So we're done with that guy because he was annoying and he was creepy and weird. And, you know, they're getting out the prison, but like Eris's cronies are on the way. So Nesta uses the harp again to get them back to the river house. Once they get back to river house, Nesta pretty much fills them in on what happened, like what Lanthus was doing and what he showed her. And then at some point Rhys gets the idea of like, wait, Eris is kind of shaky as far as the alliance, so you know how we get him back? We seduce him with Nesta, because Nesta can dance very well. And at the Solstice party for the Court of Nightmares, Eris is going to be there, so his idea was getting Nesta to dance with him to more or less seduce him into staying in the alliance. But before they do that, Nesta has this urge to go back to the cottage that her Feyre and Elaine used to live in, as, you know, like I guess a way to confront her memories. And she's like showing, you know, Cassian around, showing her, you know, where they slept. Like he was like, you know, I hate this bed, you know, I was born in this bed, my mother died in this bed. And, you know, the paintings that Feyre made for her, Elaine and Nesta, like in, you know, Cassian comments on the fact that like she drew the night sky before she knew Rhys was her mate and all that. And you know, she pretty much gets to a point like with her father that like, you know, it enraged her that he didn't do anything after, you know, his leg got shattered and after they lost the money. And she like is feeling remorse about the fact that she let Feyre go out into the woods, but she doesn't know how to properly tell her how she feels. And then Cassian's like, you'll get to a point where you're able to tell her. And once Nesta gets back, she tries like to sit and listen to a fire without dredging out the memories of the past. So she manages to sit for a couple minutes using the mind sling techniques while listening to the fire, and she reminds herself that this is just a fire, this is not your father's neck, this is your body reacting, and you will deal with it, you know? And then afterwards, the house, because it's close to winter solstice, the house itself that has pretty much a personality now, lures Nesta into the heart of the house, and she finds out that all the darkness and all the bad things is a reflection of what the house is, but also the people around it, their fears, and like, you know, their deepest, darkest fears and nightmares. So it's showing, the house is showing you what you fear, but also like the house is showing you itself. And Nesta's like, you know, like, oh, thank you for, you know, showing me this. So they get to the Court of Nightmares, and, you know, Nesta, oh, well, Feyre, like, Rhys, like, lifts up the shield a little bit so that everyone in the Court of Nightmares can smell Feyre's scent and not only see, but smell that she's preggers. So that's a whole thing. And, you know, I think Eris is like, oh, congratulations. And, you know, Feyre's just like, well, I won't be dancing with you, my sister will be. And Eris sees Nesta, and Nesta's all decked out in black, and she looks good. And, you know, they dance. Nesta's apparently a really good dancer. She does like all the spins that apparently it's really hard to do the 9 spins because you either do it really well or you just end up on the floor. But she does it, and then Eris is like so impressed with this that he ends up trying to ask her for her hand in marriage. It's also funny because as they're dancing, like Cassian's sitting there just like mad. He's like, I want to dance with her. And it's funny because apparently Cassian took dancing lessons from Moore, just like Moore taught Nesta the dances from the Court of Nightmares, just so he can dance with her. And I think that was so sweet. And like, I'm still not over the fact that like my dude Eris really danced with her 3 times and is asking for her hand in marriage. Like, can you think like the power that this woman has? Because not only was it Eris, it was also Lanthus, the monster, that wanted to like marry her. And I'm just like, bro, like this is the second dude that tried to propose to her. Like Nesta, I think Nesta has the power of seduction. I think that might also be her power. Like that could also explain how even like Healy and Loki wanted her. Like I think Nesta has the power of seduction. I think that might also be her power from the cauldron. Like that's my theory. And next what happens is there's the winter solstice scene. So if you remember everything that happened in Aquafast, winter solstice didn't really go that well, at least not for Nesta. But you know, it goes pretty okay. Like, you know, people give their gifts. I think I have a theory that like Nesta and Azrael have this kind of unspoken bond, especially like when he talks about like, you know, holidays aren't stupid, you know, it brings people together, and you know, they kind of like look at each other and just like, I know where you're coming from. And also Azrael gives Nesta a gift, and it's like a small like reading light so that if it's dark and she wants to read, she doesn't have to strain her eyes. And Nesta's so happy that she like ends up hugging Azrael, and it's a really cute moment. And that's also why I think like they had this sort of like unspoken bond, because like all the people in the inner circle who like had a problem with Nesta, it didn't really seem like Azrael really had a problem with her. It's almost like he understood her in a way. But then later that night, after everyone's gone to bed, Nesta's in her room and Cassian comes in and he tries to give her her present, and then Nesta's like, I assumed I wasn't getting one from you. But apparently it's this thing called a symphonia, and it's a rare device in Helium's court that apparently never caught on. And it's more or less an iPod. It's an iPod. Cassian got her an iPod because she loves music. And this device can trap music, and you can listen to it whenever you want. So yeah, more or less she got an iPod Nano for winter solstice. Nesta being Nesta, kind of her first instinct is like, I can't accept this. And then Cassian's like, why the hell not? And Nesta's like, you know, if I'm gonna look for a present, I'm gonna look to Eris. And then Cassian's like, you really aren't considering yes. And then she's like, maybe I am. And then she's like, well, I'm not with you, we're just having sex. And then, you know, Cassian obviously gets mad about that. And then he explains like the reason why he cut in at the ball is because he was jealous. He was mad about Eris. And Nesta drops his bomb, and she's like, well, Eris is the brute, you know, I want to marry him because I'm a piece of shit just like him. And then like Cassian's like, what? And then she's like, yeah, I deserve Eris. I don't deserve you because you're good, you're kind, Cassian. And it's so sad. It's just like Nesta really thinks that low of herself that she doesn't deserve Cassian, because Cassian's a nice guy. And it's just like, you know, she was still talking about the fact that like she failed so many people and that's her punishment, and the fact that she wanted Cassian but she wouldn't let her have him because she didn't think she deserved it. And then they have this moment where, like, you know, Cassian's like, you're not gonna marry Eris, and then Nesta's like, no, and he's like, there's gonna be no one else for either of us, and he's like, yes, ever. And here's the point where, you know, they make love, and I believe at some point all signs point to this being where the mating bond snaps into place. Like, yeah, all signs point to this being the place where like their mating bond snaps into place. This is definitely where it happens. And also this is where she finally asks him to spend the night, to stay. But then the next morning he's like, I gotta go. We have a snowball fight to get to. So he kind of avoids her for like 3 days. And in the meantime, Azriel is the one doing the lessons, doing the training. And then when she's talking to Emery, she explains that Cassian's got the walk. Now, what is the walk, you may ask? Good question. The walk is when a male knows how to use his cock well and struts around with a swagger that basically declares it to everyone. And I love how Emery, like, really is just like, no, Cassian's got the walk. And that's just like, you know, after being alive for 500 years, I hope you know how to use it. But then he's just like, well, I've also been proved wrong by like previous hookups. So I'm just like, see, you just gotta look for the walk. And this is also when they spend some girl time together. They have this cute sleepover, and like this is like one of my favorite scenes in this book, because it's just like they're in a bathtub together, fully clothed, but it's just full of bubbles, and they're giggling, and they have like little fireworks like in the corner of like a Pegasus, and they're eating like a bunch of cake, and then they make like these cute bracelets for each other, like these friendship bracelets. And apparently, I think Nesta, when she was making hers, like she like imbued some power into them, so now they're like magic friendship bracelets, and it's just perfect. And by the time Cassian gets back, they have been practicing, and they're finally going to try to cut the ribbon that can officially prove them to be Valkyries. And Gwen is the first one to get the ribbon, and then it was Emery, and then Nesta became the third. And it's like this whole thing where they after they finish the ribbon, they get put like this like obstacle course, and obviously they don't get through it at first, and Ezra's like, you guys aren't gonna get through it, and then Gwen's like, we're gonna prove you wrong. This is like when Gwen and Az definitely have this like kind of tension a little bit. Like Gwen seems to have a crush on Azriel, because it's this moment where Az is like, what is going on? Nesta's like, you have no idea what you started. And she's like, remember how Gwen was with the ribbon? You're the new ribbon, Az. And I'm just like, he's the new ribbon. He's our new conquest. But they managed after a couple days to get through, or maybe a couple weeks to get through the course, and it's revealed that it was actually the Blood Rite qualifier. And on the day that like the 3 got it, the other priests were sent away, and Lord Devlin, who was an Illyrian like lord, and someone else was actually watching them, and Cassian apparently didn't know it was the Blood Rite qualifier, but Az did. And you know, they're as close to being Illyrian warriors as they could be, aside from taking the Blood Rite. So yeah, they're both Valkyries and like Illyrian warriors at this point. Like they passed both tests. And then there's the final test that Nesta sets for herself. She finally makes it all the way back down the steps, no way back up, without, like the second time, because the first time she was so full of anger that she didn't realize it, but she actually does it. She puts her mind to it, and this is also the night of Starfall. So instead of going out to Valera, she goes back up to the House of Wind to participate in the party. And then, you know, Amren and Nesta had this, like, they were friends, but then they had this falling out during the one summer. But during this scene is kind of where Nesta gets down on one knee and is just like, I'm sorry. And she's like, you gave me kindness and respect, and I, you know, treated them like garbage. And Amren kind of tells Nesta that, like, the house sings, like, you made the house. And then Nesta's like, what? I didn't do anything. And apparently, like, Nesta, when she came here, she wanted a friend the most, and that's what the house became to her. It became a friend. And, you know, they have, like, this moment where, you know, they become friends again. And then Amren's like, welcome back to the Night Court, Nesta Archeron. The day after Starfall, there's mention of like this rare red star that freaked everyone out, including Rhys. Again, back to Kingdom of Ash. If you read it, you know what that star probably was, and that's probably why it freaked people out. But I digress. So afterwards, they have this conversation with Eris and like talking about like, oh yeah, we forgot to tell you about the Dread Trove. Oh yeah, whatever. And then, you know, they get back to Valkyries, and Nesta and Cassian try to have this cute moment, but then, you know, Cassian is kind of like, you know, does it undermine, you know, being seen with me? And then Nesta explains like it's different for Feyre and Rhys, but it's like, it's almost like she's uncomfortable being seen with him in public. And then, you know, the bomb drops. Cassian's like, oh no, I skipped a line. Nesta's like, well, it's for Feyre and Rhys because they're mates. And then Cassian's like, and we're not? Which I called it from the beginning, but like, Cassian's just like, oh, because we're mates and you don't want us to be. So they had this whole like argument, and then Nesta's explaining like how it like removes her last shred of humanity because, you know, for humans, husband and wife is as good as it gets. There's no idea of mates. And then, you know, they have this thing where Nesta calls in her favor because she just wants Cassian to get away from her, and she requires that he goes up to the House of the Wind for a night and not to talk to her until, you know, she talks to him first, or until a week has passed. So that's where it is. And then, like, you know, the tattoos they got from the initial bargain goes away because the bargain has been fulfilled. So she goes up to Emery's place in Windhaven and she tells Emery everything. And then Moore apparently goes and gets Gwen. So Gwen shows up. So, like, you know, they have more girl time, talk about everything. But what happens after this is they get kidnapped, of course. Because, yeah, of course, after, like, there's always something that happens after someone is, like, mated, right? It's like something bad is gonna happen now, right? So, yeah. They get taken away into the Blood Rite. So like Nesta wakes up in the Blood Rite, and she actually wakes up before everyone else, probably because she's made, and, you know, she kind of gets a head start, but she runs into this guy who's like trying to kill her. And for some reason, although with the Blood Rite there aren't supposed to be weapons there, like planted there actually were in this game. We don't find out yet, but Nesta grabs a knife, and right when the other Lyran guy is trying to attack her, she kills him, steals his clothes, and like loots him. So, and then her next task is pretty much to try to find Emery and Gwen, and she knows that they've probably been separated. But meanwhile, as this is happening, Cassian, who wants to go after Nesta, but, you know, can't because, you know, there are laws that can't be broken because you either get killed and then the person that you took out of the Blood Rite gets killed. So in the meantime, while this is happening, they have to go save Eris, because Eris, of course, gets kidnapped. And at this point, I'm just like, what is with everyone in ACOTAR getting kidnapped? Like, please explain this. Like, can I explain, like, in every book, in the first ACOTAR novel, Tamlin gets kidnapped when he gets taken out of the mountain to Amarantha. In Akamath, Rhys gets, like, shot with the ash arrows and gets kidnapped, and Feyre has to save him. And then also, like, Nesta and Elaine get kidnapped and put into the cauldron. In Act of War, Elaine gets kidnapped. And then the only book that they don't get kidnapped is in A Quarter of Starlight. Every ACOTAR book, I'm just gonna expect like someone to get kidnapped, because I feel like this happens in every book. Someone gets abducted and it's like, oh no, we have to save them. And it's like, why? And it's a double whammy in this one. It's not only like Nesta, Gwen, and Emery, it's also Eris that gets kidnapped. That's why the Cassian and Az have to go after him now. And I'm just like what, like, you got, what is with you guys getting kidnapped? Like, what is happening here? And of course, Cassian has to go with Az because, you know, more, I think, has business. And then Rhys doesn't want to go because he can't die, because, again, the bargain that they made at the end of Act War has come back to bite them. And I was mad about the bargain, but I'm at least glad that it has, like, actual consequences, you know? Like, I figured it would have consequences, but I was like, I'm glad that the consequences are here. And it's like, oh, well, yeah, like, you know, if Rhys dies, well, like, going to, you know, the continent to see, like, Braylon and, you know, Eris, if he dies, Feyre dies, but also the other way around. If Feyre dies, Rhys dies. And then Amren's obviously mad at them because she's like, you hopeless romantic fools, why would you do this? And I'm just like, I agree, why would they do this? That was the worst thing ever. But, you know, at least it was a consequence, and we're seeing this consequence play out now. The fact that, like, Rhys can't go because if he dies, you know, Feyre dies and so on. So yeah, that's why Cassian has to go with Az to get Eris. And obviously he's mad about that because he wants to go get Nesta, but also he can't get Nesta because of the laws. And yeah, it's a whole thing. But Nesta, using the magic bracelets, somehow they're able to, like, kind of like pin their location in a way. So the wish that Nesta made of the bracelets is no matter what, we'll always be able to find each other and get back to each other. So I guess the bracelet kind of like took in that into the Blood Rite, even though the Blood Rite doesn't allow magic. But I guess it's different because Nesta was made and she made the bracelets, so they're able to still kind of work against like the magic in the Blood Rite. So she's able to kind of sort of track Emery, and also this like other Illyrian guy that's trying to kill her kind of says like, oh yeah, the crippled bitch. So like she knows like, oh well, yeah, Emery is somewhere around and she's alive. So she finds Emery, but it's not before like getting to the river and seeing like Emery injured, because you know she's like, she hit her head on a rock, so she's injured. So Nesta has to kind of carry her back up. So it's also a problem because they're in the cold, and at night there is these like creatures that come out to like kill everyone. So there's like a lot of danger that's happening, and being injured doesn't help this. But luckily Nesta and Emery managed to find like this what looks like a boulder, but it's actually a cave, and this guy Balthazar doesn't try to kill them because he's like, nah, I'm not gonna try to kill you guys, only if I have to. So he apparently just wants to make it to the mountain, and also he knows who Nesta is, and that's part of the reason why he just spares them and lets them go into the cave, which is nice and all, but it's just like, of all people, this guy is just like, nah, I'm not gonna kill you guys, he's gonna like help you guys out a little bit. And I'm just like, I don't know, I have a theory that we might see this guy again at some point. So they run into this group of guys and they see a nightgown hanging from a tree. So they're kind of just like, oh my god, something happened to Gwen. And apparently it was a trap that they put up because they knew it would lure them there. But Gwen was one step ahead, and she kind of lured these like monsters in the woods to the group, and then she's like, hey guys, run so these monsters don't kill you. So they meet up with each other once again, and she's kind of just like, well, how did you manage to survive? And apparently Gwen also woke up for the others, and the explanation is like, maybe it's because they're not Illyrian. It's a cute moment where Gwen's like, you two came looking for me, and they're just like, of course we did, that's what sisters do. And I was like, and also there are like these moments where, you know, they get to the bridge and they like beat up these guys before they get there, but then there's a whole another group of guys who get there, and they have to kind of like pull like a whole like Indiana Jones thing where they like, you know, Gwen is injured because she got shot in the leg with an arrow, so they tie her around to a tree because they're on the other side, and they pull Gwen, they cut it down the bridge, so they all go falling. So they cut down the bridge, so everyone goes falling except for Gwen because she's tied to the rope. So they pull her up, and then while this is all happening, they have to like, because not only is Emery like someone injured, so is Gwen. So they're a little bit slower, but they managed to make it to the foot of the mountain Ramiel. And this is where I got emotional when I read it, because this is where, you know, they were gonna just like stay there and not go up the mountain. But Gwen's like, no, we didn't come all the way here to not, you know, fully go there. And then we learn Gwen's story about what happened to her, and Shangri-La, what happened to her sister. Her sister died, and when she was assaulted, and the fact that when she came, you know, to the library, she didn't speak for months, she didn't even sing, but over time, you know, she started to get out of bed more often, and working with Mira helped her, and then she met Nesta. And also with Emery, it's revealed that, you know, her father was abusive. He abused her mother first, but then when her mother died at the hands of her husband, it all went to Emery, and Emery also, her wings were clipped because of her father. And then Nesta tells them everything that happened, you know, with Highburn and the war, and the fact that her father died, and everything that happened since then, with how she coped with everything. And she really expected them to not accept her, but they do. And, you know, they're just like, we're gonna go up this mountain and we're gonna win this thing. So they're climbing up the mountain, and while they're climbing, they notice Bellius, who's Emery's cousin, and his group. They're coming pretty close. So Nesta's first instinct is to be like, hey, you guys go up and I'll stand down and like, you know, protect you guys against them. And Gwen's of course like, yeah, no, I'm staying with you. And then Nesta uses this kind of like pinch, like pressure point thing to like knock Gwen out. And then Nesta's like, hey, Emery, can you take Gwen up to the mountain? And Emery's like, sure, I guess. So, you know, Nesta gets ataraxia, and she's like preparing to like, you know, beat these guys up. This is also where it's revealed that ataraxia in the old language means inner peace, which is really fitting for like this whole story of not only self-discovery, but like learning to heal and how to heal yourself from trauma. So I think it's a really good name, ataraxia, inner peace. And also, while she's fending off against Belias's people, they get further up the mountain. And then when, you know, Nesta cuts down the rest of them, she finally gets to Belias. And as she's fighting Belias, a light flashes, which tells her that Emery and Gwen made it up the mountain. They won. So, you know, there gets to a point where Belias is just like throwing out swords. He's like, I'm gonna fight you with my bare hands. And I'm just like, why? Like, why? To make it more dramatic? And then while this was all happening, you know, Cassian like sees Eris, and then Braylon, and then Cochet, who's like the wizard guy that was controlling Vasa, and also like includes Braylon, like, you know, he gets captured by them and controlled. So by the time that, you know, Nesta is fighting with Belias, there's a moment where it looks like Belias is gonna kill her, but then Cassian shows up, kills the guy, but then it's like, yeah, he's being controlled by Braylon. And then Nesta's kind of like, okay, so this is where the evil villain monologue happens. So Braylon is kind of like, she orchestrated this whole thing. She controlled Belias and his friends so that they would go and attack Nesta. And on top of that, she meant to just get Emery, capture Emery and take her to Blood Rite, and she thought that, you know, Nesta was reckless enough to go follow after Emery, but then she made it easy by going right to Windhaven as well as Gwen, so she ended up capturing both of them, taking them all into the Blood Rite. And that's when she also planned to get Cassian close enough to ensnare him with the crown. And she pretty much does this because she's like, I will make myself young again, then I'll leave you alone, which is a lie, because like she's not gonna just leave them alone. And then, you know, she gets Cassian, Braylon gets Cassian, shouts orders to say kill, but she doesn't specify who. So Cassian, who at this point kind of is broken from the spell, shifts the knife to himself, and then that's when Nesta just erupts. It's like her power just comes out all at once at this point, and she grabs Braylon, knocks her down, and then she turns her face young, but like then she pretty much erases her from existence. So she unmakes her. She's able to make and unmake things, and in this case, she literally just unmade Braylon. It really shifts really fast because, like, you know, Nesta and Cassian have this moment, and, you know, Cassian's like, oh, you unmade her, and she's like, well, she had it coming. And then literally as soon as they happen and as they kiss, it's like Mor and Az just like come up, and Mor's just like, it's Feyre. And I'm just like, damn, they couldn't even have a moment before it was like they barely had. I think there was one thing that would critique is just like, it was like really fast where it was just like, it's Feyre, and it's like, well, geez, we barely had a moment of reprieve. So they get Winnow back to the river house, and it's revealed that Feyre was bleeding out, and, you know, she's supposed to be pregnant for 10 months for Faye, but she's 2 months early, and, you know, she's bleeding out, she's losing a lot of blood, and then Feyre's kind of like, just cut me open. And then, you know, in Prythian, like, no one's been able to, you know, do like a C-section successfully, so Maja's just like, we can't do that. And then like Feyre's like, no, do it, you have to. Maja gets the baby out. The baby is a stillborn, and Feyre's like still bleeding out. You know, she's cut open at this point. And then Rhys is crying, and because like if Feyre dies, that means Rhys is gonna die too. So like time kind of slows down, and then Nesta during this time summons the whole Dread Trove, the mask, the harp, and the crown at the same time, and she pulls one of the strings, which is the third string, that's time itself. And as the harp is kind of talking to her, like saying, is that not what you wanted to feel? Nothing. And she's like, I thought that's what I wanted. But she's like, I want to feel everything. And, you know, it's like this emotional moment. And then she says to Feyre, you love me when no one else would. And she admits, like, she's like, I love you, Feyre. And as the harp's like string is still like moving, she says, like, pretty much makes a bargain and says, you know, I give it back. I give all this power back as long as you can save them. And like at first Amren's the only person that notices this happening. Then Cassian notices, and then like Rhys is like trying to get to Feyre, but they're holding him back. And then they're like, look at the light. And then pretty much the power from Nesta, from the cauldron, is like flowing into Feyre and also the baby to keep them alive. And she keeps saying, like, I give it back, I give it all back. Then Feyre apparently heard her say I love you, and she says to Nesta, like, Nesta, I love you too. And I was just like, oh. And Nesta and Rhys have this moment where Rhys literally gets down on his knees and he's like, thank you. And Nesta drops down too, and they hug and they have like this cute moment. And I'm just like, this is nice, because like this whole time it was like so much like animosity towards like towards each other with like Nesta and Rhys. Like they just didn't really like each other, and this is the moment where it's like, you know, they have like, they're starting to form this kind of bond, and it only took for, you know, his mate and her sister to almost die. But yeah, no, you know, it happened. They like each other now, and they end up naming the baby Nyx, and the baby's cute. He has dark hair and blue eyes, and I'm just like, oh, that's so cute. But you know, Cassian's kind of just like, so is all your magic gone afterwards? And she's like, I gave it back to the cauldron in exchange for knowledge for how to save them, but you know, a little bit of her magic still remains, and I guess something else stopped the cauldron from taking all of her powers. She also made some changes. So, you know, as that was happening, to avoid it happening again, she somehow changed Feyre's anatomy so that it was like an Illyrian woman's anatomy, and she also did it to herself. And Cassian's just like, wait, you're ready to have a baby? And Nesta's like, no, but I did it just in case. And I'm like, that is smart. I was like, that's a smart idea, because it's like, I was thinking that like as it was happening, as she was like fixing Feyre, I was just like, wait, if she has a kid, wouldn't she die? Like, you're just gonna repeat that again? But Nesta was smart and she thought it through, and I was like, oh, thank God. Because I was just like, that would suck if like years later it's just like, oh, we're doing a repeat of this because you guys just want to have all these Illyrian babies. And then, you know, they're talking afterwards, and he's kind of like, you could have ruled the world for power. And she's like, yeah, I don't want to rule the world. And she's like, I want a disgustingly ornate mating ceremony. And I'm like, you go, girl. And I like how it was like, the options are like a huge mating ceremony or just like a stale biscuit. Like, that's your options for Cassian. Cassian's like, those are my options. And it's like, yes. Like, that's what you get. You're either getting a biscuit or you're getting a whole shebang bang. Also, like, one of the last chapters, Cassian briefly meets with Eris. And, you know, like, he's trying to like ask about like, why'd you leave more in the woods? And like, of course, Eris is not going to answer that. But like, the last things he says is like, I see you, Eris, and I know you're not that bad of a guy, but you're just too much of a coward to be a good guy. Which, yeah, I think like that sums up what Eris is. It's like, I feel like Eris could be good, especially like in Akawar. There's some of those in Akawar, it's like, he could be good, but it's just like, he growing up, I guess, in the Autumn Court, it's like hard to be sometimes. But of course, like the last chapter, it ends like, you know, Feyre and the baby, they're going like to meet their father's gravestone, and Elaine comes with them. So does Nesta. And Nesta has this kind of thing where she like tells them to go back, where she like kind of is thinking like what to say to her father, and all she can admit is that like her father died for her with love in her heart, and though she may have not deserved it then, she would do all she could now to earn it, to deserve not just his love but those around her. Some days might indeed be difficult, but she'd do it to fight for it. And she says, you know, thank you to her father. And of course, like, Cassian's like above, like watching her, and she's like, you busybody. But it's like a really cute ending, because she smiles back and she hurries down to see Feyre and Elaine, and you know, they have like a sisterly bond back again, and it's so sweet, and it's a sweet ending. And I love this book. I absolutely loved it. Like, going in, I knew that I was gonna enjoy it, but I did not know that I was gonna love it. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't know. Like, I think A Court of Silver Flame might be, like, for me, the same level as, like, A Court of Mist and Fury and, like, Crescent City. Like, and those are, like, my favorite Sarah J. Maas books. So this is, like, definitely, like, a favorite. And also, like, Air of Fire. But, like, this is definitely, like, a favorite. Like, I didn't know going in this would be a favorite. Like, I knew, like, I love Nessian. So I was like, I'm definitely gonna like the book, but I know I was gonna love it this much. And also, bonus chapters. Like, I just read, like it wasn't in this edition, but I was able to, like, somehow get the bonus chapters for, you know, Feyre's POV and Azrael's POV. And apparently Sarah said herself that, like, she was gonna put, like, the Feyre POV one in the middle of the book, but, like, her editor said no, because it'd be weird. And I agree, like, it would have been very jarring to go from, like, Nesta and Cassian's point of view and third person omniscient to, like, Feyre's in first, you know, like, that would have been really weird to put in the middle of the book. I think that was the problem with A Court of Frost and Starlight. So I'm glad she didn't do that. I'm glad she took that out. But, you know, the Feyre POV was literally just, like, after, like, telling them that they were pregnant, and kind of gives a glimpse into, like, what happened when they found out, where, like, Rhys kind of scented her and he was like, the baby! And, like, how they got to the name Nyx. So Nyx apparently is, like, a night court, like, old, like, goddess name, but they repurposed the name for, like, a boy. So, like, we know how, like, the name Nyx came about. And also, not much happens in that one, but I think the Azrael one more happens. Like, I had a theory that like maybe Az didn't like Elaine in like a romantic way, like it was just like a guardian kind of way, but I was wrong, because when I read this chapter I was just like, oh, he likes Elaine in that way. But then the whole time he's like thinking like, I can't do this, you have a mate. And I'm like, yeah, you, first of all, Lucian is literally like sleeping in that house. What if he just walked in and saw it? Like, they were literally about to smooch, and I'm just like, oh my god. And I'm just thinking like, the way Az was thinking, I was like, I'd never heard this guy think like this, but also we've never really seen Az's point of view, which is why I wanted to see it. But also like Rhys like kind of catches them like having the moment where he's trying to put on the necklace for Elaine, and they're like about to kiss. Rhys sees, and he's like, to my office now. like he has like such a dad moment. But like Rhys berates him for like almost kissing Elaine, and Az is like upset about this, but he's like, yeah, I guess I should back up. And then like he later goes to the training ring, because we know he trains at night to like, you know, stay away from everyone else. Or I forgot why he trains at night exactly, but Gwen is there, and Gwen's like, oh hey, and they have like kind of this conversation, and like she's like trying to like cut the ribbon, like she's practicing, and then Az in the process like ends up helping her, and like they have this moment. And then at the end of his chapter, we see that he's in the library, and he goes to Clotho, and he's like, can you give this gift to Gwen? And then, you know, Clotho's like, oh, do you want me to tell it that it's from you? And he's like, no, just say it's from a friend. Which I thought was like interesting, because it's like, I don't know, because I think this chapter, it's like, it started out with like you thinking like, okay, so he's gonna end up with Elaine, but then it's like, okay, maybe he's gonna end up with Gwen. And I like him with Gwen just because Elaine already has a mate, and I feel like even if Elaine likes him, it's like complicated with the fact of like Lucian, and you know, like I feel like Az deserves his own person. Like I feel like he doesn't need to have someone else. Like after the whole thing with like Moore pining after her for like 500 years, I feel like he needs someone new. So I feel like Gwen is a good match for him. And I think like, especially we've seen like during the training where like she's like looking at him, and like he's like the new ribbon for her. Like I do see Gwen and Azrael together. Like I'm like leaning towards that ship a lot more, because it feels more realistic than like Azrael and Elaine. Like I feel like Azrael and Elaine is kind of like a pipe dream at this point. But one of my final thoughts, I mentioned at the beginning that like a lot of certain parts reminded me of A Court of Mist and Fury, especially the reaction like Nesta has with the mating bond. Kind of mirrors the reaction Feyre had like when she finds out she's mad at Rhys, and she leaves him there and spends time alone. Except like with Nesta, instead of spending time alone like in the cabin, she spends time with her friends. But you know, it's still kind of like they both have like bad reactions to it. And also like when Nesta visits the bog to find the mask, it's similar to like, to me it's similar to when Feyre went to the Weaver to get the ring. Like it reminded me of that, as well as like their prison scenes reminded me of each other, and also the Starfall scene. Like I don't know, like I feel like there were a lot of parallels between A Court of Silver Flame and A Court of Mist and Fury, in my opinion. Like it wasn't the same, like obviously they were two different stories, but I do think like there were some parallels. I think the relationship between Nesta and Cassian is very different from Feyre and Rhys, because in Akamath it was more of a slow burn romance happening over time, whereas like Cassian and Nesta, it was kind of like right away they were like, you know, doing it. But I feel like it was because Feyre kind of had more like baggage, because she was just getting over Tamlin and like breaking off their wedding, so she needed more time to warm up to Rhys, whereas I feel like Nesta and Cassian already had like this tension anyway, and it just needed to be taken out. And of course it took them a while to actually like admit their love for each other, but it was still like there. Like I feel like the relationship was just different, because like Nesta and Cassian are very different characters, very different wants and needs, so like the relationships are different. And I don't mind the fact that like this wasn't much of a slow burn. I think it would have made less sense if it was a slow burn. I think the fact that they started, you know, hooking up right away made more sense than it happening over time, just because of like the way Nesta was. It kind of like makes sense that she would have wanted to start like that rather than admitting their emotions. Like I don't know, it made sense to me. Like it didn't bother me that it was like super smutty, because I was glad about that. But like, yeah, no, it makes sense. The relationship is very different, and obviously like it's not going to be the same. Like I think it'd be boring if like the relationship was just the same as like Feyre and Rhys's, to be honest. So I'm glad that it was different. I'm glad the way they got together was different. Of course there were like parallels, like the reactions to like the mating bond, but like other than that, you know, it was new. It's a new story. It's more or less like a part of like the new like spin-off series, but this is like more or less a standalone. I would have loved to have more like Nessian stories, but like, I mean, I guess this is good for now. Again, I would love to have more Nessian stories, but I'm like really hopeful for like what Sarah does in the future. Like maybe we'll get more on more, because we didn't really see her in this book because she was in Valaham the whole time. So part of me is guessing the next book might be about her because she wasn't in this book. But then I'm also thinking maybe Azrael, because this book, the bonus chapter, focused on Azrael, whereas like Akafast, I don't think there was a POV for Azrael. So I'm like, it might be about him and like Elaine and whatever happens with like Lucian. But I'm also curious about like Lucian and the Band of Exiles, like what's happening with that. Like it would be fun to like know what's happening with him, you know, and like Jurian and Vasa, and also what happened during that time where like he met up with Vasa and like, you know, Feyre's dad. Like that would have been really interesting. So like there are a lot of things I'm like really curious about knowing. Oh, and also, you know how there with the Dread Trove, there is 3 that we know of, but I think Aaron mentioned there might be a 4th one. And while, you know, Nesta and Cassian were in the prison battling with Lanthus, in her vision with him, she saw, you know, she had the crown, it was the mask, and it was the harp. There was another 4th object that was like shrouded in mystery, like you didn't see it because it was like in a shadow. So I'm thinking at some point in the series we might see the 4th item of the Dread Trove, or like they're gonna have to find the 4th item, because I think the 4th item might still exist, but we just don't know what it is yet, and neither does Amryn. So I think that's a theory that I have is gonna happen. The 4th item's gonna have to be found. And I was thinking like there's probably gonna be 3 books, but I was like there might be, if not 4, there might be 3, and then like a novella that's focusing like on the 4th object maybe. I don't know, that's my theory. But all in all, I really love this book. This is definitely probably one of my favorite Sarah J. Maas books at this point, especially because like I've noticed like similar to like Crescent City, like how like with the friendships with like Bryce and Danica, like the friendships with Nesta, Emery, and Gwen, like the way she actually has like friends in this, because I think it's different with Nesta with like Feyre, because Feyre, sure, she had friends with the inner circle with like Amryn more, mostly more, and like Cassian as, but I feel like not that it was forced on her, but it was kind of like, who else are you gonna be friends with? Of course, like Polina, who like is like running the art gallery with Feyre, like they're sort of friends slash business partners. But I think like I'm glad Nesta was able to like go out and actually like make friends of her own, because I feel like the inner circle, they're cool, but like of course Nesta's not going to necessarily gravitate towards them except like maybe Amryn. So I think like it's realistic that she was able to find other friends, just because I don't know, it would have made sense if she like just stayed in the inner circle. And I was like hoping we would get new characters anyway, because it's like, not that I don't love these characters, but I feel like with Feyre and Rhys, I feel like their story came to a good end, and I feel like I don't mind them being like minor characters, or like technically like side characters in this book, but like I feel like focusing on them more is kind of like making me like them a little less. Like, I still like them, but it's just like, okay, we get it, guys. You guys are happily together. Like let everyone else have their chance, you know? But yeah, I think I really enjoyed it. I love Nesta's POV. I liked Cassian's POV, and I thought it was interesting, like the difference between like how he viewed like certain characters versus like how Nesta viewed certain characters. And it was like always like this angst with like Nesta, even like the relationship with Feyre, whereas like Cassian's relationship with Feyre wasn't strained at all. Like I thought things like that were very interesting to see, especially compared to each other. And I really love the story itself. Like I said, it's more character driven than plot driven. Like I don't want to say like the plot is like secondary, but it's kind of like, you know, the whole Dread Trove thing doesn't really come into play until like the halfway point, or almost the halfway point, where like she has to, you know, really like find the mask. So because the first part, I would say the first half is more like the healing process, but it's happening over the course of the whole book. But the second half is like more focused on like, you know, the Dread Trove and like thing with Eris. So that being said, like it is like mostly character driven, and I feel like, I mean, I like Nesta, but I feel like maybe if you don't like Nesta, this book, you probably have to like warm up to it. I feel like by the end of this book you will like Nesta, or at least have some understanding of her character, you know? Like I always loved Cassian. I think Nesta is a lot to handle, but I think she is an enjoyable character, and I think she's a very interesting character. Like And it's so sad because they could have pretty much said Elaine wasn't interesting. But like, no, Nesta's like a really interesting character. Like in some regards, maybe even more so than Feyre. So like, I don't know, I really enjoyed this book. I give it 5 stars. I really loved it. And those are my thoughts on A Court of Silver Flame. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I did. And if you enjoyed this and want to see more book related content, please like and subscribe. Bye.